Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our stories. Before I get started, tell me where you're watching from. I'm curious to see which cities and towns will join me in this memoir. The screen fades to black, and the deep, steady voice of the narrator cuts through the quiet. He was a man born on a small island in the Mediterranean, but his name would echo across continents. Napoleon Bonaparte. To some, he was a savior, a visionary who reshaped Europe with his brilliance. To others, he was a conqueror whose hunger for power consumed millions of lives. But before he became a legend, he was just a boy from Corsica, a child with dreams far too large for the small world he knew. The story begins in 1769, in the sun-scorched town of Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica. The air smelled of salt and rebellion. The island had just been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France, and the Corsicans, proud, fierce, and weary of foreign masters, seethed with resentment. In a modest stone house overlooking the sea, Letizia Bonaparte gave birth to her second son, Napoleon. His father, Carlo, was an ambitious lawyer loyal to the island's cause but pragmatic enough to bend when the winds changed. Napoleon grew up hearing the sound of muskets in the distance, the cries of rebels who fought for Corsican independence, and the sermons of his mother, a woman of iron faith and discipline. She ruled her household like a general, teaching her children endurance, thrift, and pride. Young Napoleon absorbed every lesson. He was small, quick-tempered, and fiercely intelligent. His classmates mocked his Corsican accent, his awkward French, his stubbornness. But he studied harder than anyone else, pouring himself into books about history, war, and heroes of old, Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal. When he was 9, his father secured him a scholarship to a military school in France. The journey from Corsica to the mainland felt like crossing into another world. France was polished, proud, and powerful, and Napoleon was an outsider. At Brienne, the cold walls of the academy could not have felt more distant from the warmth of his island home. But there, amid mockery and loneliness, his resolve hardened. He learned strategy, mathematics, and the art of command. He studied storms, how they formed, how they broke, and said, "One day, I will rise like that." At 16, he graduated from the École Militaire in Paris, becoming the youngest artillery officer in the French army. The year was 1785, and France was simmering with unrest. The nobility feasted while the people starved. Napoleon, the poor islander with a sharp mind and burning ambition, began to see a storm brewing, a revolution that could shatter the old world and make room for new men to rise. He returned to Corsica, still torn between loyalty to his island and opportunity in France. The revolution erupted in 1789, and suddenly, everything changed. Kings trembled, and commoners shouted for liberty. Napoleon watched as old institutions crumbled and chaos spread. He sided with the revolutionaries, believing in the promise of equality, though his loyalty was not to words, but to order and possibility. When Corsica turned against revolutionary France, Napoleon faced an impossible choice: his homeland or his future. The local leader, Pasquale Paoli, once a hero to him, branded Napoleon a traitor. The Bonaparte family fled their island under threat of death, sailing to mainland France as refugees. Napoleon was 24, with no home, no fortune, only a name and a burning will. It was in France's chaos that he found his opportunity. In 1793, the port city of Toulon had fallen to royalist rebels, supported by British ships. The French army was in disarray. Napoleon, a young captain, saw what others missed: a way to reclaim the city. He drew up a plan, precise and bold, using his knowledge of artillery to strike at the British fleet's weak points. His plan succeeded. Toulon fell. In one night, Napoleon went from a dismissed refugee to a hero of the Republic. The name Bonaparte began to travel through the ranks. The people saw a new kind of leader, calm under fire, relentless in vision, and loyal to none but France's survival. He was promoted to brigadier general at just 24. But behind the triumph, he remained restless. He wrote letters to his brother, confessing, "The world leaves me cold unless I am making it move." As France's revolution grew bloodier, with guillotines in every square, Napoleon stayed clear of politics. He had seen enough to know that men with ideals often fell to their own hunger for power. Instead, he turned to discipline, order, and ambition. In 1795, when royalists again rose against the government in Paris, it was Napoleon who was called to save it. Standing in the heart of the city, he gave the order that would define his legend, a whiff of grapeshot, he called it. His cannons thundered through the streets, crushing the rebellion in minutes. Paris fell silent, and the government owed him everything. The young general's fame spread across France like wildfire. To some, he was the embodiment of the revolution's promise, a man who rose by merit, not birth. To others, he was a dangerous soldier, too brilliant, too hungry. But Napoleon had already set his eyes beyond politics, beyond France itself. He dreamed of glory, not for glory's sake, but to prove that destiny belonged not to kings, but to those who seized it with their own hands. And somewhere, deep within that quiet determination, a storm was gathering, one that would soon sweep across Europe, changing everything in its path. The narrator's voice softens, almost like a friend reminiscing. From a small island in the Mediterranean, a boy rose to challenge the greatest empires of his age. But his rise came at a price, one that would test not only his power, but his soul. Stay with me, because in the next part of our story, Napoleon will take his first great gamble, a campaign that would make him immortal. The screen fades to black, the music swells softly beneath the closing line. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who dared to believe that destiny could be conquered. When the dust of revolution began to settle, France was broke, bleeding, and surrounded by enemies. The monarchs of Europe looked at the young republic with hatred and fear. They called it chaos. They called it madness. But to Napoleon Bonaparte, it was opportunity. It was the spring of 1796. The French army in Italy was starving, demoralized, and forgotten. Their uniforms were tattered, their shoes worn to the sole. Officers squabbled, soldiers deserted, and the mountains of northern Italy seemed to mock them. The generals above them saw the Italian front as a dead end, a distraction from the true battles in Germany. But then came the order that would change everything. Napoleon Bonaparte, at only 26 years old, was appointed commander of the army of Italy. When he arrived, many of his men laughed. He was small, thin, and pale, with long hair tucked under a simple hat. He didn't look like a general. But when he spoke, the laughter died. "Soldiers," he said, his voice echoing through the valley, "you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains of the world. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." They believed him. Maybe not because of his rank, but because his conviction was real. In his eyes, they saw something they hadn't seen in years, purpose. And Napoleon moved like no general before him. He didn't fight by the old rules of slow marches and long sieges. He struck like lightning, fast, unpredictable, decisive. His strategy was simple but brilliant: divide the enemy, strike where they were weakest, and never let them breathe. The Austrians and their Italian allies were confident at first. They had more men, more supplies, and better positions. But they had never faced Napoleon. In a matter of weeks, he shattered their lines, one victory after another. Montenot, Lodi, Castiglione, Arcole. Et Lodi, the legend was born. The Austrians had fortified a bridge across the Adda River, their cannons turning the crossing into a death trap. The French hesitated, until Napoleon himself seized a flag, charged forward across the bridge, and led his men through a storm of shot and fire. The river turned red, but they took the bridge. That night, as campfires burned across the valley, the soldiers began to whisper a new name: Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. A general who fought beside his men, who shared their danger, who seemed untouchable. In a single campaign, Napoleon transformed the army of Italy into a legend. He defeated forces larger than his own, captured cities, and filled France's empty coffers with gold. He redrew the map of Europe, not with treaties, but with speed and daring. His victories made him a hero at home and a nightmare abroad, but amidst the glory, another story unfolded, a personal one. In Paris, he had met a woman named Josephine de Beauharnais. Elegant, charming, and 6 years older than him, she had survived the revolution's darkest days. To Napoleon, she was grace incarnate. To her, he was a curious mix of genius and volatility. They married just days before he left for Italy, and though she doubted his promises at first, his letters told another story. "My dearest Josephine," he wrote from the front, Since I left you, I have been constantly sad. My happiness is to be near you. Let me see some of your faults, and I shall love you still more. He wrote these letters between battles, sometimes while cannon still smoked in the distance. He was a man who could command thousands yet crumble before one woman's silence. Love and ambition drove him with equal fire. As his victories piled up, Europe took notice. The Austrians sued for peace. The map of Italy changed forever, old kingdoms fell, republics rose, and France's influence spread like wildfire. When Napoleon rode into Milan, the crowds cheered as if a liberator had arrived. He promised them freedom, equality, a new order. But even he knew that revolutions rarely stayed pure. Behind the cheers, he began to see how power reshapes ideals. Still, he pressed on. Each success fed the hunger within him, not just for glory, but for destiny. He saw himself as the architect of a new world. And yet, deep inside, he feared the same thing every great man fears, that one day, history would forget his name. When he returned to France in 1797, he was no longer the obscure Corsican officer from a forgotten island. He was the nation's shining hero. Crowds filled the streets to see him, women threw flowers at his feet, and men whispered that he might be the one to restore France's greatness. But in the eyes of the government, the weak, corrupt directory, he was dangerous. They owed him their power, yet feared his ambition. So they gave him a new task: lead an expedition to Egypt, to strike at Britain's trade routes and expand France's reach. It was meant to keep him busy, far from Paris, where his influence grew too large. Napoleon accepted, but his reasons were his own. Egypt was not just another battlefield, it was a stage for immortality. He saw himself as a new Alexander, marching east to carve his place in the ancient sands of history. Before he left, he stood once more before his soldiers, the same men who had followed him through hunger and triumph. Soldiers, he said, you have conquered the finest armies in Europe. You will now face a new challenge: unknown lands, burning sands, and a people whose history goes back to the dawn of time. But remember, you carry with you the destiny of France and of the world. As the ship set sail from Toulon, the sun sank into the horizon, turning the sea crimson. Behind him, Europe held its breath. Ahead lay Egypt, mystery, glory, and the beginning of a transformation that would turn the soldier into a ruler, and the man into a myth. The narrator's voice softens once more, steady and thoughtful. In Italy, Napoleon proved that genius could outshine birth, and that courage could rewrite the fate of nations. But as he chased the horizon, he began to learn that victory carries a cost, that even a man who commands empires cannot escape himself. In our next chapter, we follow him into the burning deserts of Egypt, where ambition meets destiny, and where legends are born in the dust. The screen fades to black, the music echoes softly, and the words linger. This is not just history. This is the story of a man who believed the world itself could be conquered by will. The year was 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte, at 28, set sail from France not just as a general, but as a visionary. His destination was Egypt, a land older than any empire he'd conquered, a place where the dust of pharaohs whispered of eternity. The journey itself was immense, more than 400 ships carrying soldiers, scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers. It wasn't just an army, it was an expedition, a floating civilization. Napoleon dreamed of more than victory, he dreamed of discovery. He told his men, soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you. He wanted to link France's revolutionary glory to the immortal grandeur of the ancient world. When they landed in Alexandria, the heat was suffocating, the air thick with dust and mystery. The French soldiers gazed upon temples half buried in sand, hieroglyphs carved by hands older than their faith. They were in awe and terrified. The locals looked upon the invaders with suspicion and anger. The desert, silent but merciless, seemed to judge them all. But Napoleon wasted no time. His armies marched toward Cairo, through heat that could melt iron and thirst that broke men's minds. Along the way, Bedouin raiders struck their supply lines, and disease crept through the camps. Still, the young general pressed on, calculating every move with cold precision. He was not fighting kings now, he was fighting nature itself. Then came the Battle of the Pyramids. Before him stood the Mamluks, elite horsemen of the Egyptian beys, proud warriors who believed their charge could crush any foe. Napoleon studied them, saw their brilliance and their weakness. "Form the squares," he ordered. "Let no man break the line." The desert exploded with gunfire. The Mamluks charged again and again, their sabers flashing in the sun, but the French lines held, silent, disciplined, unbreakable. The thunder of cannon shook the sand, and when the smoke cleared, the Mamluk army lay shattered. In one day, Egypt's ancient power had fallen to a man not yet 30. As the soldiers stood beneath the shadow of the pyramids, their victory was silent and strange. Around them lay the ruins of an empire that had once ruled the world. Napoleon gazed at those stones, massive, timeless, untouched by the centuries, and in them, he saw a reflection of what he longed for, permanence. But the desert, like destiny, does not give without taking. Soon after, disaster struck at sea. The British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, discovered Napoleon's fleet anchored in Abuka Bay. In a single night, the French ships were annihilated. Flames turned the sea red, and explosions lit the sky like a dying sun. Napoleon's army was stranded, cut off from France, trapped between the desert and the Nile. Yet even in ruin, his resolve did not waver. He turned defeat into defiance. "The sea is lost," he told his men, "but the land remains ours." He reorganized, rebuilt, and explored. His scholars documented everything: the stars, the sands, the secrets of ancient tombs. From this came the Description de l'Egypte, a monumental work that opened Europe's eyes to the wonders of the East. It was during this time that one of his officers unearthed a strange stone inscribed in 3 languages, Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. It would later be known as the Rosetta Stone. Through it, the lost language of Egypt would one day be understood. Even stranded in defeat, Napoleon had sparked a light that would outlast his empire. But in Egypt, glory began to blur with isolation. The endless sun burned through his illusions. His soldiers grew weary, plagued by sickness and heat. Rebellion stirred in Cairo. The desert that had once felt like destiny now felt like judgment. In the silence of those nights, beneath a sky scattered with stars older than Rome itself, Napoleon began to think not of conquest, but of legacy. He was thousands of miles from France, yet he could feel it, Europe shifting, changing, restless once more. The revolution was faltering. The government that had sent him away was collapsing under corruption and fear. He decided it was time to return. Quietly, secretly, he left Egypt, leaving his army behind. To many, it was betrayal; to him, it was necessity. He crossed the Mediterranean disguised, landing on French soil in 1799 to a nation desperate for stability, desperate for a hero. When he stepped onto the streets of Paris, the people erupted in celebration. The government was failing, the economy was broken, and the revolution's ideals had turned to ashes. France needed more than politicians; it needed direction, order, and purpose. Napoleon, ever the strategist, saw the moment for what it was, his greatest opportunity. In November 1799, he made his move. With his loyal officers and soldiers, he surrounded the chambers of government, forcing the leaders of the Directory to resign. It was bloodless, precise, almost surgical. By nightfall, the Republic was his. The coup of 18 Brumaire marked the end of revolutionary chaos and the beginning of something entirely new. France woke to a new dawn. The Constitution of the year 8 declared Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul, the supreme leader of the nation. His words that morning were quiet but unyielding: "The revolution is over. I am the revolution." And so, the young general who had once been mocked for his Corsican accent now ruled the greatest power in Europe. The boy from Ajaccio had outmaneuvered kings, crossed deserts, and bent history itself. Yet deep inside him, that same restless fire burned. He had conquered nations. Now, he would seek to conquer time. The narrator's voice lowers to a near whisper, carried by the music's soft crescendo. In Egypt, Napoleon learned that ambition is not only power, it is loneliness. But from that loneliness rose the man who would crown himself emperor, reshape Europe, and leave behind a legacy of brilliance and contradiction. In our next chapter, the story continues: the birth of an empire, the wars that shook the world, and the fall that would teach even the mighty that destiny demands its price. The screen fades to black. The music fades with it, leaving only the echo of the words. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who reached for eternity. By 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte had transformed from a revolutionary soldier into the unchallenged master of France. The streets of Paris hummed with anticipation, the people caught between reverence and curiosity. The revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, had been tempered by years of chaos, war, and fear. France no longer sought the abstract promises of revolution. It sought order, and Napoleon was the embodiment of it. It was on December 2, 1804, in the majestic Notre Dame Cathedral, that Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. Unlike any monarch before him, he lifted the crown from the altar and placed it upon his own head, declaring to the world that his authority was not granted by God, nor by men, but by destiny, and by the will to seize it. Pope Pius VII sat in stunned silence, a witness to history being rewritten in a single, audacious gesture. Napoleon's reign as emperor was defined by ambition, reform, and relentless warfare. He reorganized France, creating the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that balanced authority with rights, protecting property, establishing meritocracy, and reshaping European justice in ways still felt today. Schools, roads, and the arts flourished under his guidance. To his people, he offered not just leadership, but a vision of France restored to greatness. Yet, no empire rises without challenge. Europe watched, tense and fearful. Coalitions formed, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, all determined to stop the man who had conquered nations faster than armies could muster. And yet, Napoleon's genius on the battlefield was unparalleled. At Austerlitz in 1805, he faced an army more than twice his size. On a fog-laden morning, he positioned his troops with precision, baiting his enemies into a trap. When the sun broke through the clouds, his forces struck, and the Allied armies collapsed. It was a victory that became legendary, a masterclass in strategy, psychology, and courage. Napoleon stood amid the battlefield, calm and commanding, a man whose vision seemed to bend reality itself. Over the next years, his empire expanded. The Grand Army marched across Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the icy plains of Russia. Everywhere he went, he left marks, cities reorganized, institutions rebuilt, and armies both inspired and terrified by his presence. Yet, even amidst triumph, the seeds of strain were growing. Constant war drained France's resources, while nations chafed under his rule. The Russian campaign of 1812 became the turning point. Napoleon, confident and undeterred, led more than 600,000 soldiers into the frozen heart of Russia. Moscow, he hoped, would bow and surrender. But the Russians retreated, burning villages and crops, leaving nothing for his advancing troops. The French army, unprepared for the brutal winter, suffered hunger, frostbite, and relentless attacks. By the time they retreated, only a fraction of the army remained. Napoleon's aura of invincibility began to fracture. In 1814, the Allies invaded France. Paris fell. Napoleon, who had once crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame, now faced exile. He was sent to Elba, a tiny island in the Mediterranean. Yet even in exile, his presence loomed large. Europe, restless and divided, could not resist the pull of the man who had once ruled it all. A year later, he escaped Elba and returned to France, greeted by cheering crowds in what became known as the 100 Days. The young officer who had once crossed the Alps now commanded an army once more. But destiny, as ever, has its price. At Waterloo in 1815, facing a coalition led by the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon's forces were defeated. The battle was fierce, the courage unmatched, but the tide of history had turned. Napoleon was exiled again, this time to Saint Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, far from France and far from the world he had tried to conquer. There, in isolation, he reflected on his life, dictating memoirs, sharing stories of battles, strategy, and vision. He was no longer the unstoppable general, but a man confronting the weight of mortality and the limits of ambition. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away. Yet even in death, his life echoed across time. He had reshaped Europe, rewritten law, inspired armies, and transformed the idea of leadership. From a small boy on a Corsican island to the Emperor of the French, he had lived a life of extraordinary determination, brilliance, and complexity. The narrator's voice softens, almost a whisper. A Napoleon story is not just one of war and conquest. It is the story of vision, courage, and the relentless pursuit of destiny. It reminds us that greatness often comes with sacrifice, that ambition can inspire nations, and that even in failure, a life lived fully can leave a mark on the world for centuries. He was a man who dared to challenge history itself, and for that, he will never be forgotten. The screen fades to black as the music swells one final time. The words appear slowly, lingering. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica who became a legend, a man who reached for the impossible, and a life that still teaches us about courage, ambition, and destiny. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight?